From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones.
One of my first assignments after I moved to Germany for The Times in the summer of 2018 was to go and interview a young woman pretty much exactly my age, so end of her 20s, in a coffee shop, the kind of place that has cheery little signs saying, "Live in La Vida Mocha." And she turns up very sort of fresh-faced, short hair, a little bit nervy, which was understandable given that she sometimes had to have police protection when she left her house. The reason for that was that she had quite recently left, in a very public manner, a German political party called the Alternative für Deutschland, and trying to get to grips with this right-wing party and to understand how they saw themselves. I asked her quite early on in the interview what their model was, what they kind of looked to as their political template. And she didn't even hesitate. She just looked me straight in the eye and said, "It's the Nazi Party."
At the beginning of this month, Germany's political mainstream got a big shock.
Now, the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has urged mainstream parties not to lend support to the Alternative for Germany, the first far-right party projected to win a state election since the Second World War.
The far right, the AfD, made a dramatic breakthrough. They won the state of Thuringia in the east in regional elections. It's where the Nazis first got a foothold in 1929. The AfD came second in Saxony as well and are even eyeing another win in Brandenburg later this month. Is this German politics on a loop? Or perhaps a different, more modern flavour of extreme politics? The story today, the AfD and Germany's Nazi past.
My name is Oliver Moody, and I am the Berlin correspondent for The Times and The Sunday Times.
And we've had recently some regional elections, haven't we? Actually, we've got some more coming up as well. And the story out of that seems to be far-right doing well. Is that fair?
Exit polls from the public broadcaster ZDF say that the far-right AfD party has won the most votes in the state of Thuringia, but might not be able to form a government.
If there are three words designed to kill the average Briton's attention span, it is German regional election. But this is the first time that the radical right has won a significant election in Germany since 1933.
Tell us about the woman who you met in that coffee shop you were telling us about.
This young woman, Franziska Schreiber, in her mid-20s by this point. She'd grown up near Dresden, kind of very normal family background, very sort of strongly socialist. Mother, quite nostalgic for what used to be the communist German Democratic Republic. But she, growing up after German reunification, became a very kind of radical libertarian. And in the early 2010s, she found her way into what was then a very new party called the Alternative for Deutschland, that stood for a kind of package of very kind of right-wing, Eurosceptic, anti-establishment ideas. And she had risen up the ranks of the party very quickly.
And it didn't necessarily end happily for her. She left the party. Why was that?
Well, that is a slightly contentious story. There will be people in the AfD who will say it's because her political patron and mentor got dumped from the leadership, so she recognized her political career wasn't going to go anywhere. She maintains that it was because she was spooked by the progressive radicalization and the lurches towards the extreme right that were going on around her.
And how did she seem in this coffee house? I mean, you met her there, as you said, with these sort of kooky signs about mocha coffees and the rest. I mean, and did she seem sort of scarred by it all?
She was a little bit nervous. I think it's her first time talking to a foreign journalist, but pretty composed. And so I wouldn't say she was kind of green around the gills or anything like that.
And she put all that in a book quite explosively. I mean, was that something that sold well, was widely read? I mean, did people pay attention to that moment?
They really did. The book came out 2018 at a moment when the AfD was really first starting to surge in national polls. It was beginning to do very well in some of these state elections. It was the first kind of real moment of panic when Germans began to contemplate the fact that a radical right-wing party could be successful at the ballot box.
And what insight did she give in that book? I mean, what did she say about its inner workings and motivations that seemed to spook people so much?
The basic claim was that if you read through the AfD's manifestos from that period, but also today, and if you're a kind of Carlton Club stripe of British Tory, you'll be looking through it and stroking your chin and saying, do you know what? I could get behind a lot of this. You know, more aggressive measures on deportations, more aggressive measures on stripping citizenship from foreign criminals that have dual passports, abolishing the license fee, very kind of small state, economically liberal fiscal policies. This is the kind of stuff that is what we would think of in Britain as being on the right wing of the Conservative Party. But she said that beneath the bonnet, the language that she heard from senior people in the party, the memes that were going around in private WhatsApp groups, revealed a rotten soul. And her argument was that this kind of facade of conservative reasonableness was just a front for what was a much darker, more authoritarian, fundamentally racist or even fascist project.
And what kind of conversations or things did she come across which sort of illustrated that for her?
In 2016, just after the kind of peak of the big European migration crisis, Germany suffered its worst terror attack in many years when a failed asylum seeker from Tunisia drove a lorry into a Christmas market in central Berlin, killed 11 people, injured 56. And what Franziska Schreiber says is that in these AfD chat groups, people were jubilant. They were rejoicing at the fact that so many of their compatriots had died because they thought this would finally provide an opportunity for the AfD to hammer home its messages about immigration and to cement its popularity. That was one example that's particularly stuck in the mind, but there would be all kinds of things like anti-Semitic jokes, suggestions that Jews were the kind of inner enemy of Christianity, calls for unaccompanied teenage refugees arriving in Germany to be chemically castrated. And when she tried to kind of call this language out, she often found herself getting dismissed as a Kampflesbe, which is kind of German slang for a fighting lesbian.
The party, the AfD, is quite new and sort of grew quite rapidly. They formed in 2013. I mean, take us back to that time. Why? What was happening then that meant this party came into being?
So at this point in time, the kind of conservative social democrat coalition government under Angela Merkel is in the driving seat of the Eurozone crisis. And Merkel has had to agree for German taxpayers' money to be contributed to a bailout of Greece in order to hold the euro together. And there are a lot of people on the German right that are very unhappy about this. They feel that their taxpayers are having to carry the can for the kind of fecklessness of Southern Europeans who'd been borrowing like there was no tomorrow, while the Germans had been tightening their belts for a decade. And so a group of people from Merkel's party, but also kind of tweed-jacketed economics professors, came together, and in response to Merkel's famous line that there is no alternative to what she was doing, they said, yes, there is an alternative for Germany, eine Alternative für Deutschland, and that was how the party was born.
In the present day, 2024, what is the AfD's policy platform? I mean, how would you describe what their pitch is now?
Nicht nur ein tolles Wahlergebnis bejubeln können, sondern auch Politik in die Tat umsetzen können. Für mehr innere Sicherheit und für Remigration.
Their pitch is overwhelmingly concentrated on immigration and law and order. In fact, to the point where the two issues are essentially inseparable. This idea that particularly irregular immigrants, asylum seekers, refugees are an unconscionable burden on the German taxpayer. They are overstraining public services. They are very often committing violent crimes against native Germans and getting off scot-free, largely on kind of psychiatric grounds. But beyond that, the AfD was kind of interestingly the first big political party in Europe to go really hard against net zero back in 2018, when there was almost universal consensus about the kind of urgency of climate change. They were very much ahead of the curve on that one. They believe in kind of very austere fiscal policies. I'm not sure that most of their voters actually realize quite how small state they are. They believe in effectively abolishing the public broadcasters, limiting the number of people on a track to go to university and diverting more young students towards vocational college. A lot of these policies are kind of within the European conservative mainstream.
And yet it has, as you suggest, got quite a sort of hearty dose of kookiness sprinkled over the top, including, and I'm going to say this wrong, Kyffhauser Mountain?
The Kyffhauser Mountain is in Thuringia, the state that the AfD have just come first in. And it is something like the Disneyland of German nationalism. So legend has it that the medieval Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa is sleeping in the bowels of this mountain, waiting for the trumpets to blare out so he can rise again and lead the German nation back to its ancestral birthright of dominion over Europe. More recently, there was a statue to Hindenburg at the top of this mountain. It's absolutely kind of thick with symbols of Germany's imperial past. And the AfD had annual meetings at the top of this mountain, led by a guy called Björn Höcke. He is the party's figurehead in the East. He's its leader in the state of Thuringia. He's also probably the most kind of prominent elected right-wing extremist in the entirety of Germany. And you have these meetings where the entire party is coming to his power base to kind of pay their respects, and people kind of chanting, Deutschland, 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 as Höcke really goes into these very kind of shouty crescendos about how it's time to restore the greatness of the German nation, how the sun is rising in the East, and how the traitors to the fatherland are going to get their comeuppance.
Die politische Sonne über dem Osten wieder aufgehen lassen. Und wir werden dafür sorgen, dass diese politische Sonne bald über ganz Deutschland wieder scheint, dass der gesunde Menschenverstand wieder zur Herrschaft gelangt, dass ein natürlicher Patriotismus wieder Raum greifen kann, dass wir wieder eine lebendige, frohe Nation, ein lebendiges und frohes Volk sein werden. Denn das ist es, was wir wollen. Wir wollen nichts Unmoralisches. Wir wollen nichts Unrechtmäßiges. Wir wollen nur das Normalste von der Welt. Wir wollen so leben wie andere Völker.
How much at its spiritual centre is the AfD neo-Nazi? Because we're always drawing these allusions between the two. And as you say, the policy platform is something which actually a lot of European conservatives could get on board with, and yet there is still this whiff of Nazism around it. I mean, how fair is that? And what do they say to that charge as well?
It's a really difficult question to answer, because neo-Nazi effectively, is in the kind of common parlance, means not just fascist, not just very strongly right-wing, not just racist and xenophobic, but the whole shebang, the whole Nazi policy platform, wanting to bring it back, the eradication of the Jews or the various other racial conspiracy theories. And there are people in the AfD who absolutely subscribe to that package. There are people in the AfD who hang out with groups that are basically the Hitler Youth redux. There are people who will quite routinely and deliberately use bits and bobs of Nazi rhetoric to kind of fire up their supporters. But are they neo-Nazis? I think what we're dealing with here is a 21st century form of radical right-wing politics or right-wing extremism kind of mixed together that's very difficult to categorize. And in some ways, I think this debate about are they the return of the Nazi Party or not misses the point and the particularity of what they're trying to do in 2024.
What are the 21st century twists on that, which are different to, say, what we saw in the 1930s and 40s?
So the emphasis this time is very much not on territorial expansion or revanchism or anti-Semitism. In fact, the AfD is anything relatively pacifist and anti-interventionist, and it wants very much to restore what it sees as Germany's natural special relationship with Russia. It's very friendly towards China as well. The project is overwhelmingly directed at brown people, frankly. This idea that the German nation has been kind of polluted, as somebody like Björn Höcke would put it, with non-European blood. He's written in his book that he would like to be the Zuchtmeister, which is kind of like the chief disciplinarian who would clean out the stables with what he called well-tempered cruelty. And he said he reckoned that Germany could live without 20 or 30% of its current population. So this is very much a anti-Islamic, anti-liberal, anti-green project rather than something that necessarily covers all the same bases as the original Nazi movement.
Oliver, you're taking us through the origins and the platform of the AfD in Germany, which has done sort of particularly well of late in some regional elections. When we were talking about how the AfD began, you were explaining how, in 2013 we had the Eurozone crisis and all those concerns about having to bail out Greece and places like that, and that got a lot of people feeling like they needed some kind of new political movement to get behind. It really took off, though, didn't it, when actually we started to see higher immigration into Germany, especially in 2015 when we had those sort of that enormous movement of migrants moving up through Europe, and Angela Merkel in particular saying Germany is a place where you can come and seek asylum.
Yeah, this is a case of the AfD, I think, getting first mover advantage by being very kind of counterintuitive and ahead of the curve. So in September 2015, when you have this movement of several tens of thousands of asylum seekers coming into Germany, and Merkel decides not to close the borders and to kind of dramatically speed up the asylum process for people from Syria. So they basically automatically get asylum. The mood in the German press and the German public at that point is absolutely refugees welcome, wir schaffen das, in Merkel's famous words, we will cope with this. And there was this idea that this was a new Germany, a much more kind of open-hearted country that would stand up and be counted morally in a situation like this where other European nations wouldn't, a country that had learned from its past. It was a very kind of politically powerful moment. And the AfD was the only political party of any significance saying, this is a terrible idea. It's all going to go horribly wrong. And what happened after that was that, particularly after the sort of New Year's violence, particularly sexualized violence by asylum seekers in several German cities.
The attackers, who also targeted this area outside the main station, are described as young men of Arab or North African appearance, which has led to anti-migrant campaigners claiming this is proof Germany is letting in too many refugees. One woman who was there, though, said they looked like regular pickpockets, and leaders are urging people not to come to foregone conclusions, but say they're taking swift action.
And as the kind of public mood began to sour, a lot of voters who were very skeptical about what had happened started casting around for a political vehicle for that skepticism, and they found the Alternative for Germany, and that's when it really began to take off.
Yeah, and I guess even recently, we had that stabbing in Solingen, and 3 people were killed, another 8 injured, and that's just more fuel for the AfD fire, isn't it?
The Islamic State group says it perpetrated the knife attack that killed 3 people in Western Germany. The terror militia's news agency posted a message claiming responsibility for the mass stabbing at a festival to celebrate diversity in the western city of Solingen. It said the slayings were, quote, revenge for Muslims in Palestine and elsewhere, but it provided no evidence for its claim.
They have traditionally tended to profit from moments of anxiety about immigration. And what we have seen in the last kind of 6 years is the party got flattened and marginalized by the pandemic, because there was a kind of big rally around the flag effect. A lot of Germans saw the state, at least initially, working pretty well. And the AfD just went down a kind of anti-vaxxer rabbit hole of nutty conspiracy theorists. And a lot of Germans who didn't particularly like mainstream politics looked at that and just thought, what a bunch of nut jobs, and turned away from them. So it looked like the party was on its way out. And then after the pandemic, the migration flows into Europe and into Germany started rising again, ticking back up into the hundreds of thousands a year. And migration really came back onto the electoral map in a big way, rose up the list of voters' priorities. And now with the Solingen attack, where a 26-year-old refugee from Syria, allegedly loyal to Islamic State, killed 3 people and injured 8 more with a knife at a city festival, that has really kind of crystallized a lot of this swirling anxiety about not just irregular immigration, but also about this sense that law and order is somehow in decline, and we're going through a new wave of political violence.
And especially thinking in terms of the context of the regional elections we've had as well, what is the AfD's pitch on these things?
So the day before the Solingen attack, I went to an AfD rally in Thuringia, in a town called Bad Langensalza, where Björn Höcke and his co-leader Stefan Müller were speaking. And literally 24 hours before the attack, Müller stands up on the stage and he rattles off a list of about 20 or 30 asylum seekers or refugees who have raped or stabbed to death or wounded or beaten up indigenous Germans and were let off by the courts on psychiatric grounds. And that really encapsulates their pitch, which is that the solution to both your worries about immigration and about law and order and about the state of public services is what they call remigration. This idea that we should just be deporting foreigners literally in their millions.
And by foreigners, I mean, you said earlier that it seems their issue is just with, people who aren't white as well. I mean, does that even mean sort of like 2nd, 3rd generation immigrants to Germany? It's just, you don't look like us, so off you go.
There's a bit of contention about this. So the one thing that has really hurt the AfD and kind of thrown some caltrops in the middle of its rise in the opinion polls this year has been an investigation at the start of the year where it was revealed that there had been this secret summit in Potsdam where some politicians from the AfD and some kind of demagogues from the much kind of fruitier right-wing extremist European soup had got together. And they'd been discussing plans to remigrate, in inverted commas, not just first-generation immigrants, but also people with German passports, precisely these 2nd, 3rd-generation immigrants that you were talking about.
The received wisdom for many years has been this is something that would appeal to older people, and younger people are naturally more liberal and wouldn't go for this kind of thing. And yet, in the case of the AfD, it seems like, it is the youngest voters who are keen on this, sort of Gen Zers.
This is absolutely fascinating, right? Because I think not just Germans, but people outside Germany have traditionally had this kind of stereotypical image of a AfD voter in their head. And it is an old man, probably in his 70s or his 80s, who lived through the German Democratic Republic, was a bit sad, when the Berlin Wall fell. We're kind of quite nostalgic, at least wants to believe that not everything about the communist era was bad, longs to restore relations with Russia, wants peace in Europe, a bit racist, and primarily voting AfD to give the mainstream parties a kicking rather than because he's read their manifestos in detail. And pretty much all of those details are wrong. The fascinating thing about what the data from these state elections tell us is that the AfD is now strongest in these eastern states among under 25s, followed by older Gen Z, followed by millennials. And in fact, they are the dominant party of everybody of working age in those eastern states, pretty much. And it's actually the over 70s, the people who live through the Democratic Republic, where they're weakest. We also know that these voters are increasingly backing the AfD out of conviction that they think it's a good party rather than because they just hate politics as usual. They actually like its ideas. And that confronts you with a very different set of political issues than a kind of greying protest vote. The other thing I think that's going on here is that voting for the far right is countercultural. I've actually found myself asking if it might be cool through the eyes of somebody who's kind of in their mid-20s in an East German state. Because if you want to stick two fingers up at your kind of boring social democrat or conservative voting parents, you don't do it by going to the far left. I mean, they lived under communism, so why would that shock them? You do it by going to the far right. And the AfD, I think, has exploited this very cleverly in that it has a social media game that is streets ahead of the other parties. It was the first to recognize the potential of Twitter. It's very good on Instagram. It's absolutely dominated TikTok. And it has a style of kind of provocative, slightly context-free, very memeable and ironic delivery that works really well on these platforms and makes it look kind of countercultural and I hate to use this word, but fun to a certain cast of young person.
But the way you describe it, Oliver, it then sounds like it's limited to a certain generation and a certain geographic territory. So actually you could take heart from the fact that it would never take off with many more voters all around Germany and, lead you with an AfD government and chancellor leading the entire nation.
That is indeed what a lot of German politicians are consoling themselves with as a thought. I think it's wrong. I think the AfD is definitely, it's indubitably stronger in the East, but it's also gaining in the West. We saw them do very, very well in the western state of Hesse, which is where Frankfurt is. We saw them do pretty well in Bavaria, despite a landscape that's very, very congested on the right wing of Bavarian politics. And there are two other things going on here. One is that the Second World War is slowly fading out of living memory, and that will, on some level, be gradually affecting young people. The second thing that's going on is you have a lot of young people in the West, as in the East, who are looking at Germany's future, and in particular the future of the German economy and its model of industry and export-driven prosperity, looking at the way that it's stagnating and the big manufacturers are moving production out of the country and thinking, this is desperate. What's going on with our national identity? Something's very fundamentally wrong here and might be, therefore, accessible to a pitch like the one the AfD is making.
If all these voters are going further towards the AfD and, there's a possible future where they can pick up even more success in, wider parts of Germany, is that possible because even though there might still be a lingering fear about Nazism and neo-Nazism, the AfD is not that? It might be fascist, it might be racist, it might be all these other things, but it's different enough from Nazism.
I think that's right. There are, as I said, neo-Nazi currents in the party, but I don't think they're the kind of dominant strain. And I think that gives a misleading impression of what the party's trying to do, what its strategy is. What its strategy is to try and gradually normalize the party, to drag the other parties to the right on its favorite issues, in the belief that it will always be seen as the more authentic and credible voice on immigration and law and order by right-wing voters.
Yes. So there's clearly been a big shift in politics and where certain voters are. I mean, what does this tell you about where Germany is as a country now? I mean, we always think of it as having dealt with its past particularly well, but I don't know. Does that need re-looking at?
I think it does. there's very much this idea that Germany is a template for the world in how to deal with the very dark periods in your past. And people often argue that Britain or America, for example, should follow Germany's example when dealing with their own imperial history or the history of slavery and the oppression of black people. My difficulty with the German model is that there has been a lot of consensus that it can never happen again. Where there is less consensus and clarity is what can never happen again. I think what we're seeing with the AfD now, that yes, we have a right-wing populist party that is in many parts right-wing extremist, but getting hung up on whether it is the kind of literal reincarnation of the Nazi party, I think misses the point.
Oliver Moody, Times and Sunday Times Berlin correspondent. You'll find plenty more from him at thetimes.com if you've got a subscription. Why not send this episode along to someone else who you think might enjoy it? You could WhatsApp them a link perhaps. That is all from us today. The producer was Will Rowe, the executive producer was Fiona Leach, and sound design and theme composition was by Mauro Seto. I'm Luke Jones. I'll see you soon.